Layla Martin had never intended to live in the woods, much less own a secluded property where the pine trees pressed in like silent guards, and the wind off the water carried a kind of weight you couldn't ignore. But intentions had very little to do with how her life unraveled over the past few years. A sudden inheritance from an uncle she barely remembered, and a quiet yearning for solitude led her here, to a 40-acre parcel on the edge of the Jefferson Forest Preserve, cradling a pristine, mirror-still lake that locals called Bitter Hollow. The name had an old-world chill to it, something half folklore, half caution. She liked that. She liked the quiet history in the name, the absence of pretension. It wasn't a place for tourists or family picnics. It was a place that existed without needing attention. And that's exactly why she felt drawn to it. The first months were consumed by logistics. The house, though sturdy, had sat untouched for at least a decade. The roof needed resealing. The septic system groaned like a dying animal, and the back deck had partially collapsed under the weight of years. Layla, who worked remotely as a technical design consultant, had saved just enough to manage the basics. She didn't rush. She didn't want to. There was something deeply satisfying about repairing something with your own hands, something that had been forgotten and left behind. Like her. No one bothered her here. There were no HOA meetings, no neighborly obligations, no thin smiles pretending to be friendly, just trees, the wind, the ever-changing mirror of the lake, and the occasional echo of coyotes in the far distance. In all of it, she felt finally unobserved. Still, she wasn't naive about the complexities of land ownership. Early on, during her due diligence, she'd consulted a local land use attorney named Jared Wexler. The man was blunt but thorough. Together, they had gone over the deed, the parcel history, and various zoning classifications. That's when something odd came up, a mention of a partial conservation overlay in the northeast quadrant of the lake's perimeter. It wasn't common, Jared explained, and probably hadn't been enforced in years. But technically, a small section of the lakefront was listed in a federal registry for environmental monitoring. A remnant from an old Department of Interior wetland, study dating back to 1982. It was one of those dusty, unarchived legal relics that no one really paid attention to unless something went wrong. Layla had raised an eyebrow but left it at that. There was no development planned, no disturbance of the shoreline. She had no intention of interfering with nature. That was the whole point of being here. And so, she let it be. It wasn't long before she started hearing about the so-called community norms. On a supply run into town, an older woman at the feed store mentioned, in a voice just loud enough to be overheard, that someone bought up Bitter Hollow. A man nearby muttered something about how it's been used for generations. At first, Layla dismissed it. She didn't owe anyone access. The deed was clear, but the comments kept coming. A waitress at the diner called it our lake, and one of the postal workers casually mentioned that people still like to walk their dogs along the shore, even if it's fenced now. Layla never put up a fence. That was what got her attention. Someone had been there, and someone had lied about being kept out. In response, she quietly placed a few trail cameras along the western edge of the lake, just past the stand of birch trees that marked the boundary on the surveyor's map. Within a week, the footage showed multiple people strolling along the waterline, sometimes with dogs, sometimes just lingering, looking out over the water like they owned it. One woman even stopped to take photos with a large silver camera and a clipboard, as if preparing for something. When Layla showed the footage to Jared, he advised her to record all access going forward and document any signs of encroachment. "They're playing the long game," he said. "Don't wait until it becomes a problem." She didn't have to wait long. 2 months later, after a brief trip to Bozeman for work, Layla returned home to find something so surreal it momentarily short-circuited her capacity to respond. There, at the southern curve of the lake, were 3 white canopy tents, a dozen tables covered in ivory linens, floral arrangements in ornate glass vases, a small raised platform framed by pink drapery, and a large wooden arch positioned perfectly at the water's edge. At least 30 people were present, some dressed formally, some holding drinks, all apparently oblivious to the fact that they were standing on private property. Layla parked far enough away not to draw attention and approached on foot, phone in hand but camera off. She didn't want to be impulsive. She didn't want a confrontation. Not yet. Near the arch stood a woman in a pale blue gown, gesturing theatrically to a group of guests while a man beside her laughed politely. The woman turned, and Layla recognized her instantly. Karen Holbrook. They'd met only once, briefly, at the community bulletin board outside the post office. Karen had spoken to her like they were old friends, and Layla, feeling charitable that day, had been civil. Now, Karen was on her land, hosting what appeared to be her engagement party, with a full catering setup. At the moment Layla stepped closer, Karen noticed her. She gave a polite, performative smile, the kind one gives when they assume the person in front of them is service staff or a florist. "Hi, are you with the music team? We need to shift the sound booth a little farther from the dock. Too much feedback." Layla didn't answer right away. Her mind was cataloging everything. The generators, the spilled champagne near the root system of a protected elm, the unauthorized vehicle tracks that had carved a deep trench through the moss. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but each word felt like a deliberate incision. "No, I'm the landowner, and you're trespassing." Karen's smile froze. There was a flicker of confusion, then irritation. "You're what? This is private property. I didn't give anyone permission to be here." Karen blinked, then laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Oh, you must be mistaken. This lake's always been public. People have used it for decades. I asked around. That doesn't make it legal." Karen took a sip of her drink, her posture hardening. "I didn't see any signs." "You weren't invited," Layla said. "That's what matters." Karen turned, muttering something to the man beside her, who looked at Layla and then looked away, clearly uncomfortable. The crowd around them had started to quiet, watching. Layla felt the familiar chill of being outnumbered, not physically but socially. 100 silent judgments forming in real time. She gave one last look to the lake, now shimmering with the artificial light of the party, and then turned away, back toward the tree line. She wouldn't yell. She wouldn't argue. She would document everything, and she would let the law speak where conversation failed. That night, Layla filed 3 formal complaints, one with the county land registry, one with the Department of Environmental Quality, and one with the Regional Field Office of the Forest Service. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in her study, sifting through documents, old survey maps, and the cryptic conservation overlay Jared had mentioned months before. Her eyes stopped on a series of coordinates, half-faded in the scan, just barely visible beneath the stamp of the Bureau of Land Management. She zoomed in, cross-referenced the GPS markers, and stared at the result for several long minutes. Karen hadn't just trespassed. She had built her engagement party, tents, arch, speakers, and all, directly atop a federally protected wetland zone. And tomorrow, the real storm would begin. Layla didn't sleep the night after the engagement party invasion. Her mind worked like a slow-turning engine, deliberate but relentless, pulling through every detail, every possible angle. She hadn't overreacted. She had been measured, restrained even, and yet the fury beneath her ribs hadn't cooled. The image of those white tents sagging slightly in the evening humidity, the churned-up mud along the shoreline where guests had danced or staggered, the discarded wine bottles wedged into the roots of saplings, it all replayed with cruel clarity. She had spent months treating the land with respect, understanding its balance, learning which plants came back in which seasons, marking where deer paths veered away from the water. And now, after just one night, someone's need for spectacle had undone so much of it. Early the next morning, she drove to town to speak with Jared in person. Emails and phone calls felt insufficient. She needed someone to look her in the eye and confirm she hadn't imagined the scale of what had occurred. Jared, as always, had his office in disarray, legal pads in one corner, maps in another, a weathered thermos half open on the window ledge. When she stepped into the room, he stood up immediately. "You weren't kidding in your message," he said, motioning for her to sit. "Karen Holbrook, huh? That's a name I've heard before, usually attached to some kind of civil nuisance." Layla pulled out a flash drive and handed it over. Security cam footage, trail cam images, date stamped. No permits, no notifications, no permission. I also printed stills. Jared plugged it in and began clicking through the files. His brow furrowed slowly. Damn. She brought a whole event company. This isn't just trespassing. This is commercial use of private land. And I count 3 different municipal code violations just from the chairs and the sound system setup. But this spot... He pointed at the platform erected near the south end of the lake. This is within the overlay zone. That makes it a federal issue. Potential violation of Title 16, Section 668. She might not even know what she walked into. "She didn't care," Layla replied. "She was told. I told her." She laughed and said it had always been public. "Well, she's going to find out the hard way," Jared muttered. "We'll start with the county and the Environmental Enforcement Branch. I'll draft a cease and desist to send directly to her and her vendors. In the meantime, get someone to assess the damage, preferably an independent surveyor. You'll want numbers, dollar amounts for restoration, projected environmental impact, anything that can be tied to her actions." Layla nodded, writing everything down. "And the Forest Service?" "I'll handle the notification myself. They've been aggressive about encroachment cases this year. They'll want boots on the ground. Don't be surprised if they come unannounced." When Layla returned home, the lake looked deceptively calm. The surface had smoothed out, the only movement a ripple from a heron gliding across the far bank. The party had left its mark, but the land was already beginning its slow recovery. Still, she knew the damage went deeper than visible scars. The question was how far. She called in an environmental consultant, a woman named Mel Griffin, who came highly recommended and didn't flinch when Layla mentioned federal overlays. 3 days later, Mel arrived with a field kit, camera gear, and a quiet surgical efficiency. She didn't chat much as she worked, moving around the lake's edge with practice steps, taking soil samples and photographing displaced plants, even noting where tire ruts had created water channels that would redirect runoff into delicate nesting areas. When she finished, she stood beside Layla and offered a short summary. "There's significant disturbance. Soil compaction around the root zones, chemical residues likely from cleaning products or generators, and I found artificial dyes in the water, probably from those floating lanterns they used. Also, this shoreline," she gestured toward the flattened area where the platform had been, "was part of a regrowth zone. That puts it into non-compliance with your stewardship clause, assuming the overlay's still active. You'll be responsible for mitigation unless enforcement lands squarely on the violator." "They'll try to pin it on me, won't they?" Layla asked quietly. Mel shrugged. "They always try. But with photos, timestamps, and eyewitness accounts, it won't stick." 2 more days passed, then the letter arrived. Folded into a crisp legal envelope with the Holbrook return address, it was a declaration, elegantly worded, vaguely threatening, and absolutely infuriating. Karen accused Layla of harassment, of disrupting a long-standing community tradition, and of interfering with a private celebration held in a historically accessible area. She demanded a formal apology, withdrawal of any complaints submitted to government agencies, and permission for future community access. Layla read it twice, then handed it to Jared without comment. He whistled low. This woman's living in a fantasy. She just confessed to using your property and is now demanding continued access. He drafted a formal reply on her behalf. No emotion, just fact. Trespass, documented environmental damage, federal land infringement, a legal notice of intent to pursue damages. And then he sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. Karen responded not with compliance, but with escalation. A week later, Layla returned from a hike to find 3 strangers standing at the edge of the lake. 2 men in khaki slacks and clipboards, and 1 woman pacing along the shore, speaking rapidly into a phone. When Layla approached, the older man turned and said, "You must be Layla Martin. We're conducting a land use survey in conjunction with the Jefferson Civic Access Initiative." "I didn't authorize a survey," Layla said evenly. "Oh, we're not surveying your property," he lied, a beat too slowly. "Just the general area. We're gathering input for a public usage map." "We've had requests to update the records for Bitter Hollow." Layla smiled tightly. "Then you'll know this is privately owned. And any data collection requires consent. You have 30 seconds to vacate." The woman on the phone glanced at her, sneered, and whispered something. The group left without apology, but the message was clear. Karen was escalating. If she couldn't win on legality, she'd attempt to reframe the entire narrative, make it a cause, turn the lake into a symbol. Over the next several weeks, the pressure mounted. Flyers appeared in local stores and post offices, listing Karen's version of events and calling for community mobilization against unjust privatization of shared heritage. The phrase was loaded, carefully chosen to stir up resentment. Layla received a visit from a member of the Township Council, a soft-spoken man named Reeves who claimed neutrality but encouraged her to consider a compromise. "People feel cut off," he said. "The lake's always been part of the town's identity. They want to feel heard." Layla didn't argue. She simply handed him a printed copy of her title, the overlaid documentation, and Mel's preliminary environmental report. They don't need to feel heard. They need to understand boundaries. She began installing discreet but visible signs around the property perimeter. Protected watershed zone. No access without authorization. She sent notice to nearby property owners clarifying land boundaries and listing potential penalties for trespass under both state and federal code. And then she waited. And in the silence that followed, Layla understood something important. Not everyone who breaks boundaries does it out of ignorance. Some do it with full understanding, betting that their sense of entitlement will outweigh the consequences. But for once, they had miscalculated. Layla was no longer trying to coexist. She was preparing to push back. Layla had always believed that conflict, when handled correctly, could be de-escalated. That reason and law carried weight, and that the act of standing firm was, in itself, often enough to keep escalation at bay. But as the days passed after Karen's informal campaign had taken hold in town, that belief began to falter. The lake, once an emblem of tranquility, now felt exposed, its edges not just vulnerable to erosion, but to something worse: misrepresentation. What began as a single act of unauthorized celebration was fast mutating into a story she no longer controlled. Strangers began appearing on the road leading to her property, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups. Some came in hiking gear with cameras, claiming they were just taking nature photos. Others parked by the tree line and sat in their cars for hours, watching. Always watching. And every time she approached them, they responded the same way. Polite deflection, feigned confusion, or outright silence, as though they didn't need to justify their presence. It escalated, quietly at first. A pair of garden lights near her entry path were smashed one night. The mailbox was yanked open and filled with shredded leaflets. A few weeks later, someone left a dead crow tied by fishing wire to her dock railing. Oh. That act, more than any other, pierced through Layla's usual calm. It wasn't just vandalism. It was intent. She called Jared, her attorney, that same evening and told him what had happened. He didn't waste time with platitudes. Document everything. Photograph it. Timestamp it. Start a case log. We're no longer just dealing with trespass or code violations. This is a targeted intimidation. And if I had to guess, someone's trying to rattle you into backing down before the feds get fully involved. The federal response, meanwhile, was slow and methodical. Layla had received a letter from the U.S. Forest Service confirming an active investigation into the environmental status of her property's shoreline. The overlay was officially recognized, but enforcement required multi-agency coordination. While they sorted jurisdiction, she remained in a kind of limbo. Any restoration had to be paused. Any new structures, even defensive ones like fencing, were discouraged until compliance determinations were made. In short, she was advised to do nothing but observe and wait, while Karen and her followers treated that same inaction as a weakness to exploit. The next incident removed any doubt about their strategy. Late one afternoon, Layla heard the unmistakable sound of construction. Metal striking metal, brief electrical whines, voices raised not in conversation but in coordination. She walked down the path toward the south end of the lake and stopped when she saw the source. Two men in work overalls were digging trenches with portable augers along the edge of her property, while a third man stood over blueprints on the hood of a red pickup. Karen stood a few feet away, wearing sunglasses and talking animatedly on her phone. She didn't see Layla at first, or perhaps pretended not to. The men didn't stop their work. Layla walked directly into their line of activity and spoke evenly. "You're on private land. You need to leave immediately." The man with the blueprints looked up with thinly veiled irritation. "We were told this was a public access site. We're building a temporary community dock. It's for a non-profit event." Layla didn't blink. "By whom?" He gestured vaguely toward Karen. "Her foundation, local preservation group." Layla turned toward Karen, who finally ended her call and approached slowly, the sunglasses hiding nothing. "Before you make a scene," she said with forced civility, "you should know this project is being done in the interest of the broader community. The town council is aware. You're the only one who seems opposed." Layla inhaled slowly. "This is your last warning. Leave this property now, or I will call the sheriff and file charges. You are building on federally regulated land which is also under private title. The permits you claim to have, if they exist, don't apply here." Karen gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you want to go the legal route, that's fine. But understand, the more you push people away, the more determined they become. You're not just fighting me anymore. You're fighting everyone who ever felt entitled to this lake, and that's not a battle you're going to win by hiding behind paperwork." By the time the sheriff arrived, 42 minutes later, after 2 calls and a follow-up text, the workers had packed up and left. But their trench remained, marring the soil like an unfinished incision. The deputy, a weary man named Cotter, took Layla's statement but offered little reassurance. "We don't have a trespass report on file against these individuals. It's your word against theirs unless you have video or direct signage indicating restricted access." "I do, she said, pulling up the footage from her mounted trail cam and pointing out the red boundary posts she had installed. He sighed. Then we'll make a note. But you should know, this is becoming a flashpoint. The town's split down the middle. There's folks who think you're just stirring trouble for no good reason. Others think you're being harassed. That kind of division doesn't help either side. The implication was clear. Don't expect much help. After he left, Layla stood on the ruined edge of her property and watched the lake, which remained frustratingly serene. She tried to imagine how someone like Karen thought. Not just the arrogance, but the confidence that her actions wouldn't have consequences, that enough people would cover for her, either out of shared delusion or fear of social disruption. And then, the next day, came the push she hadn't expected. She received a summons, an official letter from the county mediation board stating that a complaint had been filed against her by a local residents committee, alleging illegal land obstruction, failure to maintain historical access rights, and disruption of traditional community pathways. The language was bureaucratic but unmistakably hostile. Attached was a list of testimonies, most of them vague, some clearly fabricated, claims that she had installed electric fencing, that she had verbally threatened children near the lake, that she had posted armed patrols to intimidate hikers. Jared was furious when she showed him the documents. None of this is admissible in court, but it doesn't have to be. They're aiming for local pressure, local optics. If the board demands mediation, they can force you into a compromise hearing. Even if you win, the damage to your reputation in this community will be harder to undo. That evening, Layla changed her locks. She had the feeling that the locks weren't enough. In the days that followed, someone cut through one of her posted boundary signs and left it leaning face down in the dirt. A car idled near her gate late at night with its lights off until she approached with a flashlight. On a Thursday morning, she found a bag of garbage dumped on her porch, reeking, torn open, filled with party favors from the engagement. Someone wanted her to know. This wasn't over, and they weren't finished. Still, she didn't leave. She didn't retreat. She kept documenting, kept following Jared's legal path, and reached out to Mel again for a second phase of ecological assessment. When Mel arrived, she didn't bring words of comfort. They're treating the shoreline like it's a protest site, and every new footprint adds to the degradation. You're going to need federal backing, or this won't stop. Not from letters, not from mediation, not from logic. Layla nodded. I know. I'm done being reasonable. Mel looked at her and said simply, Good. Layla knew something else too, something deeper than fear or rage. The land wasn't just hers. It had been entrusted to her, not by people but by the silence that had once lived here. And silence, she was learning, didn't need to be passive. It could be full of intent. It could carry weight, and it could wait, just long enough to be heard. Layla had always known that fighting something rooted in emotion was infinitely harder than arguing facts. People didn't trespass on her land because they lacked information. They did it because someone convinced them that their feelings, nostalgia, entitlement, resentment, held more weight than ownership or law. And now that the confrontation had reached the level of formal complaints and manipulated narratives, she realized she needed a counterweight stronger than logic. She needed authority. Not just legal muscle, but jurisdiction that couldn't be spun with small-town politics or smoothed over with hollow charm. She needed the federal government to wake up and take notice. Jared agreed. After the mockery of the mediation summons and the increasingly aggressive provocations on her property, he escalated contact with the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of Environmental Quality. For weeks they'd been hovering. Emails acknowledged, voicemails politely returned. But no one committed. Now, with clear signs of coordinated harassment and verified environmental impact from unauthorized gatherings and construction, Jared reframed their case. He no longer asked for help. He demanded enforcement, citing the active overlay zone designation and Layla's legal documentation proving protected status. He submitted every photo, every soil report from Mel, every time-stamped entry log, and trail cam image capturing unknown individuals roaming her land. He requested an emergency compliance inspection. To their surprise, the response came quickly. 2 officials arrived without much warning, mid-morning on a Monday that had started with unseasonal frost. Their vehicle marked only with a small federal seal and a laminated placard on the dash. They wore practical gear, not uniforms, weathered jackets, field notebooks, boots thick with forest mud. Layla met them at the gate and led them quietly down toward the lake. They didn't make small talk. They didn't need to. They were the first people she had encountered in weeks who didn't question her right to be here. The lead inspector, a woman named Sandoval, reviewed the posted boundaries, then walked the shoreline methodically, recording observations, pausing at the trench where Karen's workers had tried to anchor a dock, kneeling by the uprooted wetland. Grass, measuring the incline where the tire ruts from the engagement party had rerouted rainwater and started small channels of erosion. Her colleague West took water samples near the lantern debris that hadn't fully decomposed. When they returned to the clearing, Sandoval asked only 2 questions. Had Layla initiated any of the alterations herself, and did she have a full copy of the overlay documentation? Layla answered both and handed over a hard copy Jared had prepared with highlighted annotations. Sandoval nodded once. This zone's still valid. It was never retired. In fact, its compliance status was renewed 5 years ago under new wetland restoration guidance. You're sitting on a federally recognized preservation area, and by our preliminary review, it's been severely compromised. Layla exhaled. Not relief, exactly. More like confirmation. What happens now? We'll file an incident report. If internal review confirms impact severity and property status, this becomes a Category C violation. Enforcement escalates automatically. Federal citations, possibly criminal charges if we determine the damage was intentional and occurred after notice. Whoever hosted that event didn't just trespass. They violated National Conservation Code. For the first time since it all began, Layla felt something close to momentum. It wasn't justice yet, but it was gravity, finally pulling in her direction. But with that came consequence. News of the inspection spread faster than she expected. 2 days after the federal team departed, Layla received a visit from a man she'd never met, dressed in casual denim, driving a county vehicle with faded stripes. He introduced himself as Doug Penner, a land use coordinator from the town's planning commission. He was cordial, almost warm, but his message was anything but. He explained in deliberately vague terms that the community was concerned about the shift in tone, that involving the federal government in what had traditionally been a local matter was seen as provocative. He used phrases like mutual interest and de-escalation, and spoke as though Layla had launched a vendetta rather than defended her own land. She let him finish, then asked, "Did Karen Holbrook send you?" Penner smiled slightly as if embarrassed. "Not directly, but she has influence. She has history. You're new. That changes how people respond. Fair or not. She held an illegal event on protected land. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime." He didn't disagree, but he didn't support her either, and when he left, she realized that public opinion, however misinformed, had its own inertia. one that legal truth could take months to catch up with. That night, her power flickered 3 times. On the 3rd blackout, she walked outside and followed the gravel path to her utility shed. Someone had tampered with the breaker. The panel door was swinging open, and one of the switches had been jammed forcibly with a piece of metal. She fixed it without calling anyone, but she noted the time, took photos, and added it to her case log. Jared, now keeping a copy of everything off-site, urged her to consider filing for a temporary restraining order, or, at the very least, motion-activated floodlights. Instead, she installed full periphery cameras. Mel returned that weekend with her 2nd report, this time with damage projections and restoration plans. They were extensive. Root systems compromised along nearly 20 yards of shoreline. Soil recovery complicated by synthetic debris. Surface algae disrupted by chemical dilution. Her estimate was sobering, not just financially but temporally. Full recovery, assuming total exclusion from the area and no further impact, would take 18 to 24 months. When Layla presented this to Jared, he began preparing civil damages claims in parallel to the federal complaint. Karen was about to be confronted not only with enforcement, but financial responsibility. And yet, Layla knew something else now. Karen didn't care about consequences the way normal people did. She didn't seem afraid of lawsuits, or citations, or agency letters, because this was never just about land. It was about narrative. Karen had built her identity on perception, on being seen as a connector, a benefactor, someone doing good. Layla had turned that image inside out, and Karen would not take that loss quietly. That theory proved correct when, 2 days later, a website appeared under the name Lake for All. It featured drone photos of Bitter Hollow, doctored quotes allegedly from local residents, and a video montage with inspirational music, all framed as a grassroots campaign to restore access to the lake our grandparents cherished. The footage was manipulative, heavily edited, and misleading, but compelling. The site gained traction. A petition followed. Social media pages were launched. The movement had a logo. And though nowhere on the site did Karen's name appear, Layla knew better. This was her attempt to pivot, to reframe the narrative before legal momentum overtook public sympathy. But it was too late. The Forest Service emailed an official notice of violation with language that left little room for misinterpretation. The event, hosted by unidentified parties, was deemed unauthorized. The impacted shoreline was designated a critical restoration zone, and any further unapproved access would trigger fines, criminal investigation, or both. The notice didn't name Karen, but it didn't have to. The paper trail already did. Layla printed the letter, framed it, and hung it by her front door. Not out of spite, but as a reminder that sometimes silence isn't noble. Sometimes patience is not a virtue. Sometimes restraint is simply space granted for the storm to arrive. Layla had always understood escalation in theory. She knew how pressure could build slowly, how desperation disguised itself as indignation, how people fought hardest when they sensed control slipping from their hands. But nothing in her prior experience, no legal text, no zoning battle, no environmental statute, had prepared her for the sheer scale of manipulation and hostility that followed once federal enforcement officially sided with her. It wasn't just that Karen had overstepped. It was that Karen refused to accept the reality that someone had stopped her, and now her attempts to preserve an image of authority were metastasizing into something dangerous, something deeply, personally vindictive. The notice of violation hit harder than Layla anticipated, not for her, but for the town. Within 48 hours of the letter's publication, someone spray-painted "Government Mole" across her private gate in blood-red paint. 2 of her surveillance cameras were knocked out during the night, clean hits from a slingshot or rock. A pile of rotting mulch was dumped at the bottom of her driveway. But none of that compared to what arrived by certified mail the following week, a formal lawsuit filed by Karen Holbrook, now acting as the public face of the Lake for All Coalition, accusing Layla of fraudulent land claims, obstruction of public, heritage, and emotional damages sustained during the federal investigation. Jared called her the moment he received his copy. His voice was calmer than she expected, almost cold. "This isn't about winning in court," he said. "She doesn't care if it's dismissed. She's filing to freeze your actions, bleed your time, force you into mediation again, this time under civil pretense. And it's calculated. If you retaliate too hard, she paints herself the victim. If you do nothing, you look guilty. We need a counter-strategy." Layla barely spoke during that call. Her mind wasn't on the lawsuit. It was on the implications. Karen was no longer acting impulsively. She was funding this, organizing. She had allies. And as absurd as her legal position was, she was managing to shape a narrative that people believed, or wanted to believe. That weekend, Layla drove to a local grocery store, one she'd used for months without incident. Inside, she noticed the shift immediately. 2 clerks stopped talking when she passed. A woman near the produce section gave her a tight, dismissive shake of the head. At checkout, the cashier made no eye contact. The receipt came back with no thank you. It wasn't aggressive. It was erasure. She was no longer viewed as a neighbor or even a person. She had become a symbol of federal intrusion, of unwanted change, of silence where once there was open use. And as she walked to her car, someone flicked a cigarette from a parked truck that landed inches from her boots. The driver never looked up. She told no one what that moment did to her. Instead, she acted. Jared filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, attaching every deed, federal document, and certified map available. Mel added an affidavit detailing the ecological risk of renewed public access. Sandoval from the Forest Service signed a supplementary memo reinforcing the protected status of the land. But Layla didn't stop there. She contacted a crisis communications firm, not to launch a media campaign. She refused to stoop to that level, but to quietly assess the damage to her reputation and digital footprint. The consultant, a former journalist named Deanne, offered a blunt summary after their first meeting. "They've built a mythology," she said. "You're the outsider who stole the lake. The problem isn't facts, it's story. Karen created a populist image around access, community memory, and grievance. You're just logic and paperwork. That doesn't win hearts. But we don't need hearts. We need silence. The strategy here is isolation. Make the noise irrelevant. Focus on the institutions." And so they did. Layla submitted a private petition to the Regional Conservation Authority, requesting that her land's protective classification be formally elevated to closed status due to sustained public harassment and ecological threat. It was a rare request, usually reserved for endangered wildlife corridors or sacred indigenous sites. But her case was compelling. Within a month, she received notice that her petition had been accepted for review, triggering another round of inspections, another legal hold on activity near the lake, and a quiet warning from the town council. They were concerned about the precedent. The backlash was immediate. Karen held a healing vigil at the local park, framed as a gathering for residents to process the grief of losing public connection to sacred land. It was performative in the extreme. Candles, a circle of folding chairs, tissue boxes handed out, like pamphlets. But it made headlines. A sympathetic article appeared in the regional paper titled, "When Land is Taken, the invisible cost of legal ownership. No journalist contacted Layla for comment. Her name wasn't even mentioned. But the insinuation was clear, and then came the fire. Not a blaze, not a disaster. Just a single deliberate act of arson. Someone igniting a section of her boundary fencing one night, leaving it to smolder until a neighbor driving past spotted it and called it in. The damage was contained, but the message was not. Fire marshals found accelerant. There was no question it had been intentional. The sheriff took her report. No suspects were named. That night, Layla sat in her study for hours, not working, not planning, just breathing, not out of fear, out of necessity, because it was the only thing she could control. Jared called the next morning with news she hadn't expected. The judge denied their injunction, he said. Not only that, but he ordered the Holbrook party to submit full financial disclosures related to the Lake for All Fund. If they've misrepresented any public use donations, it could cross into fraud territory. That's not civil. That's criminal. For the first time in weeks, Layla allowed herself a reaction. Half laugh, half exhale, sharp and restrained. She won't back down, she said. No, Jared agreed. But now she has something to lose. And with that loss came cracks. Anonymous emails started arriving in Jared's inbox. Fragments of documents, altered donation forms, emails forwarded from Karen's team, suggesting she had promised future access rights to backers in exchange for funds. It was murky, hard to verify, and legally dangerous to touch. But the implication was real. Someone in Karen's camp was turning. Deanne advised restraint. Let them implode quietly, she said. The moment you look like you're gloating, the narrative resets. Layla obeyed. She spoke to no one about the developments. She didn't post. She didn't protest. She stayed on her land, filed her updates, and when a regional conservation agent returned for the final assessment, she accompanied him along the lake's perimeter without a single word about what had happened. He nodded at the still visible tire ruts. They really did a number on this place. It'll recover, she said. Eventually. 3 days later, the petition was approved. Her land was now officially designated a restricted restoration site under federal supervision. Any unauthorized entry could now be prosecuted under conservation law. Karen's lawsuit collapsed within the week. Her coalition page went dormant. The online petition disappeared. No apology came, no statement, just silence. And Layla, at last, embraced it. It began not with a knock, but with a low engine idling at the base of her property. Layla had grown used to unfamiliar cars, to headlights flashing through the trees, to the constant suspicion that every sound might mean someone had stepped back across her line. But this time, there was something different. It was midday, clear and sharp, the kind of Montana sunlight that cut through shadow and demanded honesty. When she stepped out onto her porch, she saw the black SUV sitting just off the access road, doors closed, windows tinted, no movement. She waited. 30 seconds passed. Then the driver's side opened and a man stepped out in dark jeans, federal ID badge on a clipped lanyard, folder in hand. His presence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like finality. "Ms. Martin," he called, voice neutral, almost courteous. She nodded, and he approached with the bearing of someone who had no interest in wasting time. "My name is James Locke. I'm with the U.S. Department of the Interior. I'm the lead on the federal investigation regarding land use violations in the Jefferson Overlay Zone." He didn't extend his hand. He didn't need to. The badge spoke louder. She invited him in without ceremony. They sat in the front room where the late sun touched the hardwood floors, and for a moment it felt like a scene from a movie she hadn't agreed to watch. He opened his folder and began outlining the findings. Environmental damage confirmed. Illegal encroachment verified. Documented attempts at coordinated misinformation campaigns, and financial discrepancies tied to the Lake for All group. We've also received testimony from multiple individuals who originally supported the public campaign, he added. They've withdrawn their support and submitted statements indicating they were misled. He slid a copy of one such affidavit across the table. It belonged to a man named Jeremy Holt, listed previously as a logistics coordinator for Karen's event. In his statement, he detailed how he was told the land was under dispute, how he was paid in cash with no contract, how he witnessed Karen instruct her staff to remove signage and ignore boundary markers. He claimed she'd promised future permits that never existed. Layla read it slowly. Each line was more surreal than the last. "There's more," Locke said. "Our forensic accounting division traced several community donations made to the Coalition Fund. At least one contributor has filed a fraud complaint. We believe Holbrook used those funds to pay for private legal services, transportation, and promotional materials that misrepresented the nature of her campaign." Layla looked up. "What does that mean, legally?" Locke paused. "It means we're preparing to charge her. Federal environmental violations carry steep penalties, especially when the damage occurs after direct notice. Add to that the fraudulent misuse of public donation funds, possible obstruction, and multiple counts of false representation, and she's facing a combination of civil and criminal liability. We've issued a preliminary notice of legal action and requested her voluntary cooperation." "And if she doesn't?" He closed the folder. "Then we proceed without it." 2 days later, it happened. Karen was not dragged from her home. She was not handcuffed on the steps of Town Hall. But she was served in full public view, in front of a local arts fundraising luncheon she herself had organized. The moment circulated in town through whispers, not headlines. No one needed a photo. The fact that she stood frozen with papers in her hand was enough. The performance had ended, and what followed was quieter than Layla expected. Not applause, not celebration, but withdrawal. The website was taken down. Flyers vanished. A public pause notice was posted online. Thinly veiled language citing emotional health concerns and a need to step back from leadership. Karen stopped appearing in public spaces. Her name faded from weekly agendas. Even the sympathetic voices in the diner began to shift tone. Not entirely, but noticeably. For Layla, the silence was not a victory parade. It was more like a broken pressure valve, finally releasing the weight she'd been carrying since the day she found those tents on her shore. The lake looked different now, strangely cleaner, as if even the trees had leaned back, grateful for reprieve. But she wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end. Karen had resources, pride, and history. She would try to reconstitute her influence in some other form, but not here, not now, and not at the expense of this land. Jared called her that evening, voice lighter than it had been in months. "We'll proceed carefully. Civil court will take longer." But with the federal charges active, any motion from her side loses teeth. She's going to be negotiating from a crawl. And the donation fraud. That's a separate matter. Once that complaint moves forward, it may take her completely out of play. Mel visited once more that week, this time to begin soil restoration mapping now that the trespassing had ceased. She brought saplings, erosion netting, and her usual quiet competence. As they worked the southern shoreline, she looked up and asked, "How'd you hold up through all that?" Layla smiled faintly. "I didn't really, but the land did. That was enough." Mel nodded. "They always underestimate the ones who don't make noise." Later that evening, Layla stood on her dock, eyes scanning the waterline. Not for intruders, not for threats, but simply to remember what this place had looked like before it became a battleground. The birds had returned, cautious but present. The frogs were louder than they'd been all spring, and somewhere deep in the reeds, she heard movement, small, steady, natural. The world was repairing itself, and for the first time in months, she let it. In the weeks that followed Karen's very public collapse, life around Bitter Hollow began to reset itself, not with dramatic changes or sweeping vindications, but with the slow, incremental stillness that comes only when tension has finally lost its grip. Layla no longer checked her cameras 5 times a day. She no longer logged every tire mark or shadowy figure. She slept through the night without listening for voices in the dark or headlights turning off just before they reached the bend in the gravel. The lake, like a creature that had finally been left alone, began to breathe again. The reeds straightened. The insects came back. The birds nested low. The noise had receded, and in its place was something more durable than peace: quiet accountability. Karen never returned to the property. Not once. There were rumors, of course, that she had fled to a cousin's ranch in Idaho, that she was negotiating a plea deal in exchange for cooperation, that she planned to reinvent herself under a new banner, maybe something to do with historical preservation this time. But whatever her intentions, the world she had once ruled no longer existed. The town moved on in cautious steps. Some of her former supporters now spoke about misplaced energy and misunderstandings. Others said nothing at all, preferring to pretend they hadn't taken a side. The signs were gone, the slogans forgotten, the hashtags cold. In their place, something rarer emerged, a kind of communal discomfort that refused to name itself, as though the town itself had become aware of how far it had been led astray. Layla never asked for apologies. She didn't expect them. She didn't want a parade or a news segment or some public reckoning. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was to live without interference, without someone deciding for her what her property meant, what her boundaries were worth. That was enough, and so she turned her attention back to the land, working beside Mel's team to stabilize the shore, replant disturbed root systems, reinforce soil with low-impact anchors. She learned more about native species than she ever thought she would. She found rhythm in the quiet labor. Every post set, every stone placed, was a kind of answer to the months of intrusion that had almost cost her everything. Jared continued to handle the legal tail end of things, now more of a slow untangling than a fight. The civil claims proceeded as expected, methodical and dry. The fraud investigation, though slower, remained active. Karen's name was now associated with case numbers, not slogans. When Layla asked if she would ever serve jail time, Jared only shrugged and said, "Doesn't matter. She lost what she cared about most: control, reputation. That won't come back." There were small moments of closure, not grand ones. A former councilman who once pressured her to compromise sent a short letter, 3 sentences long, acknowledging that he could have asked more questions. A local teenager who once trespassed to film drone footage mailed her a USB drive with raw files and a note. "I didn't know the truth back then." And one evening, while shopping for supplies in town, Layla walked past the same cashier who once refused to meet her eye. This time, the woman nodded. Nothing more, but the gesture was real. The land, too, responded. By early summer, wildflowers began to bloom in places they hadn't for years. Water clarity improved. Migratory birds returned to the northern cove. Even the frogs grew louder. Mel called it a natural rebound, but Layla saw it differently. The lake wasn't just healing. It was remembering. reclaiming what had always belonged to it. One morning, as fog curled low across the water and the sky broke open in that pale gray light just before dawn, Layla stood on her dock with coffee in hand, breathing in the stillness. No banners, no voices, no uninvited feet crunching the path behind her, just the sound of the lake, steady and unbroken, the way it should have always been, the way it would remain. And for the first time since the beginning, she allowed herself to feel not just relief, but certainty. The land was safe, and so was she.